I had been waiting for a couple of months for the weather I wanted for this trip, and it was now well into August, and I was running out of opportunities. I decided to take a chance, and by the time Roberta had returned from her work, I had the car packed, and by the time the exhaust fumes had cleared, I was out of sight. I had sailed into Harris on 2 or 3 occasions, but had never stayed there. It was still raining, but the forecast for the following days was supposed to be quite bright. Tarbert is a busy little village, especially when the huge Calmac ferries are due, and it now has its own one-way traffic system in an attempt to relieve the congestion. There are a few quaint little shops here. Tarbert was little more than a small group of fishermen's cottages, and it was only when a pier was built in the mid-19th century and it became a terminal for a couple of David McBrain's mail steamers that it started to grow. In 1963, McBrain introduced a car ferry service, and from then on the village grew steadily. The road to the southwest coast seems to have been blasted through the rocky interior until it eventually breaks free, giving a first view to the magnificent beaches of West Harris. The rain clouds had moved on, and it had turned out a sunny evening. The weather in these wonderful islands is so unpredictable and can change many times within an hour. I made my way to the high ground above the campsite. The campsite was at Triniosopist, and on the far side below the rugged hillsides to the south of Loch Tarbert is the village of Luskentyre. And beyond are the dramatic mountains of North Harris that separate Harris from Lewis. The one problem I had with my base camp was that there was no mobile coverage, and I had to keep heading south to keep in touch with Roberta. It had turned out a beautiful night, and I made my way back up to the large lay-by above Horgabost Beach. 2 or 3 others had the same idea. The hills on the far side separate South Harris from West Loch Tarbert and the North Harris Mountains beyond. The tide was in, and the far bank the houses at Luskentyre were lined along the single-track road that wound its way along to the large dunes at the end of the road. I watched as the sun set over the island of Tarnsey to the west. This was the setting of the BBC's Castaway series. Here I was back in Leverborough. I was beginning to enjoy coming down here to keep Roberta updated. I liked the buzz here when the ferry was due. A car ferry from Bernera, linking North Uist to Harris, was introduced here in 1996 to replace the passenger-only ferry, and almost immediately the impact was dramatic. But even more enjoyable was my visits to the Butty bus. The updated weather forecast was pinned to the window, and that was the only reason I had to keep visiting it. I also have a soft spot for Stornoway Black Pudding. As the owner says, it's the only eating establishment in the island with 4 Michelin tires. The St Kilda cruise ships were berthed in the harbour. My first trip today was along a breathtaking 20-mile stretch of the most wonderful and adventurous single-track road that somehow meanders its way north through a grey lunar landscape composed of the oldest rock in the world. It winds its way around seemingly never-ending rocky outcrops and lily-clad lochans and blasts its way through what it can't get round. It's like no other landscape in Britain. It was the rush hour in South Harris. A flock of sheep were causing a bit of a traffic jam, and I decided to wait until the road cleared. It was a lovely mild autumn morning. I stood at the edge of a reed-fringed lochan and gazed towards Skye's distant Trotternish Ridge in this haunting ethereal light. Another mile or so brought me to the little coastal hamlet of Flodderby. A group of little boats sat motionless in a sea of glass, an unusually calm day in the Outer Hebrides. A finger of rock seems to enclose the bay. I took a walk down to the jetty for a look around. It's easy to see why the east coast of Harris is known as the Bays. At Manish, the single-track road rises relentlessly up and over the layers of ancient rock. It spirals north on its wonderful winding way. You have to drive at a sensible speed because in most cases you have no idea where this golden road is going to take you next. By the time we reach the summit, the rest of Manish comes into view. In the distance, the unmistakable outline of the Isle of Skye could be made out. This high ground above Manish gives an idea of just how difficult it must have been to find a way over this unbelievably hostile environment. It must have been an engineering nightmare building a road through the rockiest low-level landscape to be found anywhere in the British Isles. It would appear that where there was no way past, a route was blasted through. And where that proved impossible, the road was just built up and over. No wonder it was named the Golden Road. About a mile beyond Manish, we arrive at Gyo Crab. I went back to the car and carried on along this exhilarating road north. The winding road enters the village of Stocknish with its old church up ahead. One of the residents was fishing down below from his garden. What a life! You don't have to travel far for your dinner here. Before a road was built here, these beautiful little cottages were built into every crevice in the rocks. The seas were their highways. The busy south-facing harbour is well protected by Ellen Stocknish at the mouth of the bay. At the head of this loch is a signpost to signify the start of the Coffin Route, an ancient path up and over a bealach to the west coast of the island. This 7-mile round route was used by the islanders who stayed on the east coast. There wasn't sufficient suitable land here to bury their dead, so the funeral parties had to make this trek to cemeteries on the more fertile west coast of the island. The landscape was changing again. The unrelenting rock was now giving way to a sea of purple heather, and in the distance the dark North Harris Mountains were starting to get ever closer. Strangely enough, the Bays district seems to be far more populated than the far less hostile west, which is far more beautiful and without doubt the most pastoral coast in the whole island. Over the years, Lewis and Harris eventually moved from clan control to the control of wealthy landowners. In many cases, these unscrupulous characters were only interested in making profits, and in the 18th century, the West Coast Islanders were all removed from their lands to make way for sheep as part of the clearances. Their houses were burnt to stop them setting up home anywhere else in the island. Even worse, the graveyards were ploughed to remove all possible links with the past. And as I left the little hamlet of Miavaig behind, I climbed a hillock and rejoined the main road to Tarbet. Just northwest of Tarbet, I arrived at Adhazak. The sheer magnificence of the North Harris Mountains can certainly be appreciated from here. The wonderfully impressive wall of massive mountains that separate Harris from Lewis created a similar natural barrier to these island neighbours as water would have, and before the age of the motor car, the only real method of travel to either part of the island was by boat, just as it would have been had they been separate islands. I watched in amazement as a sheep lay in total disinterest as a white van hurtled round the corner, missing it by inches. It didn't move for me either. The massive range of mountains to the north ensured that the little single-track road never drifted too far from the cliff tops, and the sheep, and even cows, ensured that your attention remained focused in your driving, no matter how much competition was being offered by the stunning scenery. At one point, I ended up following a pair of cows up the narrow road. About 10 miles along this stunning single-track road, I stumbled on Amhuinsuidhe Castle. The B887 passes right through its grounds. Its name is Gaelic for sitting by the river, and that is exactly what it does. This stunning castle sits on 55,000 acres and was built in 1860 and is now partly owned by the North Harris Trust. There's a little harbour with a row of cottages at this end of the estate, and until 1944 supplies were brought in by boat. Another 5 miles brings us to the end of the road, and to the stunning white beach at Huisinish. The hill behind Huisinish belongs to the island of Scarp, the site of an attempt in the 30s by Gerhard Zucker, a German rocket scientist, to launch a solid fuel rocket carrying mail to Scarp from the mainland here, but the rocket exploded as it was launched. It seemed appropriate that a GPO van arrived just as I did. I wondered if the driver was going to pull out a rocket launcher. The singed mail was collected by the GPO, marked damaged by explosion at Scarp, Harris, and later delivered in the normal manner. I made my way back to the campsite. I went down to the beach for an evening stroll before turning in. The rollers were pounding the beach at Scarista as I headed down to my little bolt hole in Leverborough to make my usual morning call home. I also passed a little church there, with headstones lying at all kinds of angles. It had been a wild night at the campsite, and had been persistently awakened by the strong gusts of wind. It was forecasting the gusts for the following night as a 10. This was quite worrying. I headed up and over the little pass to the east of the island again, but this time I would go no further than Rodel, a mile or so ahead. As I made my way further down the glen, a lovely little lochen appeared. It was quite a dramatic view. I passed the lochen and rounded the corner to arrive at Rodel, with the attractive church of St Clemens on a hillock above the road. It was built in 1520 by Alexander MacLeod of Dunvegan and Harris. He was known as Alexander Crotach, which is Gaelic for humpback, the result of a wound received in a battle with the MacDonalds and Skye. The church is just as impressive in the inside. It has been built in the shape of a cruciform. His tomb is surrounded with a wonderful collection of medieval sculpture. The north transept contains 5 grave slabs placed against the wall. A strange feature of this church is that it is built in a coastal site, but has no sea view. I turned east at a little side road to the north of the chapel, and it curved around to meet the shore at the Rodel Hotel. Across from it was a little harbour. Creels and fishing gear were piled at the harbour entrance. 2 or 3 colourful boats were anchored in its shelter. If the previous night had been bad, then this was unbearable, as the strong gusts incessantly battered me into submission, and around 2:30 I dressed, not having slept a wink, and clambered my way into the car to see out the night. When I awoke in the following morning, the gale had not abated. I showered a lot later than usual and headed down towards Leverborough. The ferry terminal was very quiet. The St Kilda cruise ships were sitting docked at the pier. It would be far too wild to go too far out in these conditions. There was nobody to be seen in the harbour area, so it seemed unlikely that the Sound of Harris ferry would be operating either. But there are hardly a lot up here, and just to make me eat my words, a little fishing boat appeared just offshore. That surprised me. It was Sunday, and it was unusual to see a fishing boat out in the Sound on the Sabbath on these islands. I decided to head back up to base camp. The beautiful beaches come thick and fast on the west coast of Harris, and just beyond Scarista, I arrived at Trivor. As I turned the corner, I was amazed at how rough the sea was there. I went up to the viewpoint at Sailbust. If the weather was better tomorrow, it was my intention to drive over to the far bank, to Luskentyre, before heading for the ferry. The sun was trying to break through when I reached Tryrosimo at the far end of the bay. It's actually just an extension of Luskentyre. It was a lot warmer than it was the day before. A family were playing with their children at the water's edge, rather them than me. It would take quite a bit to get me in the water today. It may have been sunny, but there were still some heavy clouds about. As I turned south, the beach seemed to stretch for miles. And it does. Luskentyre stretches for almost 3 miles, and apart from the channel created by that river, it's over a mile of sand from here to Sailbust in the south. This is a stunning beach, which curves around a huge sand dune at its west end, and to add to the wow factor, we have the string of spectacular North Harris Mountains with their many moods as a backdrop as far as the eye can see. Hebridean scenery at its best. It doesn't get any better than this. The views of the distant sea were ever changing. I carried on to Tarbet. Well, my trip to this wonderful island had come to an end. The rain that had been threatening finally arrived, as did the ferry. Gradually the large car ferry eased from the quay. I watched the wonderful North Harris Peak stretch across the horizon to the north. I never saw Harris at its best. I would like to return when the conditions are right. I love my trips up